There's been a lot of clinical research on psilocybin for everything from nicotine addiction to alcoholism to depression to OCD. It's shown to be very effective because of the mixing that we talked about earlier. It introduces chaos into the brain. It mixes up the usual patterns so the brain isn't as constricted. It interrupts something called the default mode network. But if you direct that chaos, that mixing, that destabilization towards a creative orientation, they can be profoundly powerful in how they shift the fabric of our existence.
So, and just not having a cavalier attitude about this stuff also. That it is sacred. And once you start treating it that it's not sacred, then you've sort of lost the plot.
So oftentimes the people who are most attracted to LSD are people who are more cognitive, more intellectual. They notice that LSD helps them for brainstorming, helps them to be more creative.
Okay, I'm going to go there. What about sex? Paul Austin, what a pleasure it is to have you here with me. I'm super excited to have this conversation with you about psychedelics. A lot of people have been asking me about this for many years, and I met you at Prince Edward Island when I was up in Canada about a month and a half ago or so, maybe 2 months ago now. And I was so impressed with the breadth of your knowledge and everything. And we were both there for an EO conference, like a retreat for CEOs and entrepreneurs. And, I thought that the way you contextualize the role of psychedelics and what it can be, as well as what key watchouts are, I thought was really, really next level. So I really wanted to have you on my Think Tank podcast to talk about these things and to see where we could take this conversation, because it is so deep. I've done a lot of work in mathematics. And one of the long-term challenges in mathematics is how to double a cube. So how can you double a cube? So it started in the back of the days of Plato, so about 430, BC. And they had a big plague, like a COVID type of a thing. And the plague was ravaging the people, and it was going on for many years. And so finally, they decided, well, we better go talk to the Oracle of Delphi to find out what we have to do to get rid of this thing. And the Oracle of Delphi said that what you have to do is you have to double the cube to the sun god Apollo. And this cube is called the Cube of Delos. And it was in the temple of Apollo on the island of Delphi. And basically, the word Delos means to manifest. So the cube of manifestation. So this set all the Greek mathematicians crazy, because they were trying to figure out how can we properly double the cube, because they have to do it without measurement. Otherwise, it's not correct. And of course, the increase that you have to put to the side of a cube is 1.26 the length of, let's say you're starting with a side length of 1. How much do you have to increase the side length to get it to double its volume? And the amount that it has to increase is 1.26, which is the cube root of 2. And because that's an irrational number, it was thought to be impossible to draw this out without measurement. So this doubling of the cube of Delos, the cube of manifestation, was supposed to bring, if they did it successfully, which they never did, it was supposed to bring the end of all sickness. So this is the cube of manifestation, and then that lends itself right into psyche, which means mind, Delos, or delic, which means mind manifestation. And I find this whole thing just super fascinating, and I'd really like to welcome you to the show. We've got this set up, and we're going to go through the history. We're going to talk about, how these psychedelics, this plant medicine, was used, and what was the purpose of it, and has this always been from the time of Moses, and the burning bush, which was an acacia wood tree, has this always been part of the spiritual process? And so that's my first question for you. When did all this start?
So when it all started, I think we have to go even pre-civilization. There was a philosopher, Terence McKenna, who I'm sure you've heard of, who wrote a book called
Mhm.
Food of the Gods. And he had this hypothesis, we'll call it, called the stoned ape hypothesis, which was this belief that our ancient ancestors used to consume psilocybin mushrooms on the savannas of Africa, and that in fact the consumption of psilocybin mushrooms was one of the key things that was responsible for the development and growth of our cranium, of our brain. Because if you look at evolutionarily, right, I think about maybe 200,000 years ago, 250,000 years ago, there was this massive doubling in size. Some people think it was fire. Others people think it might be psilocybin mushrooms. So that was one element of the ancient use. The other element that McKenna talked about was that taking low doses helped with visual acuity. In other words, when these hunter-gatherers were out hunting for food to survive, that those who consumed psilocybin mushrooms could see with more precision. And for that reason, because they could see with more precision, they were able to better hunt and better able to survive. So McKenna makes the case that this was key to sort of our evolutionary process. Now, when we look at it more within, let's say, modern civilization, archaeological evidence has been found at Göbekli Tepe, which I'm sure many of your listeners have heard about,
Yep.
the ancient site in Turkey, where they found chalices with psychedelic aspects in it. And Brian
Sacred brew.
right, exactly, yeah, a very sacred brew. And then Brian Mirarescu, who wrote a book called The Immortality Key, talked about how not only had it been found at Göbekli Tepe, but in fact the ancient Greeks had developed something called the Eleusinian mysteries that Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, Marcus Aurelius, a number of ancient philosophers, some of the most prominent philosophers of Western civilization, participated in these mysteries where they drank a beverage called koukion, which was a beverage made from ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, the same thing that LSD is made from. So in other words, some of the most influential philosophers of our time were drinking an LSD-like beverage that helped to, I would say, elucidate some of their most influential theories. So Greek kind of history is what I love to focus on, but you see this also in ancient Vedic scriptures. They talk about something called soma, which they believe was a psilocybin mushrooms. You also have an ancient Incan civilization. They worked with something called San Pedro or Huachuma, which has mescaline in it, and it was known to be very important to the ancient Incans. And so you see the use of psychedelics in these ancient civilizations all over the world, basically from the beginning of civilization around 9,000, 10,000 BC up until, you could even say, up until the 17th century. That's when the Aztecs were still working with psilocybin mushrooms. And when the Spaniards came in, they said, no more mushrooms, right? You cannot have any of these experiences anymore. And so it's only in the last 60 or 70 years that psychedelics have been prohibited completely and totally all over the globe.
Hi, I'm Robert Edward Grant. I invite you to explore my transformative books, Philomath and Polymath, each designed to expand your understanding of the world and ourselves. In Philomath, which means lover of learning, discover how mathematics weaves together physics, music, and prime number theory, revealing the universe's interconnected nature. It's more than a book, it's an enlightening voyage. Polymath builds on Philomath's insights, exploring the genius of thinkers like Pythagoras and Da Vinci, who used geometry to revolutionize science, art, and governance. Rediscover the polymathic roots that spark past ages of enlightenment. Join me on this journey as well. Visit robertedwardgrant.com to get your copies today. Let's foster a new era of enlightenment and collaboration for a brighter future. Wow. Okay. So let's go back for just a moment then, back to this historical stuff. You mentioned the Eleusinian mysteries.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk more about that?
Mm-hmm.
Because this is something that has been coming up in my field just in the last few days. I just got back from Ibiza. And while I was there, I visited this island called Esvedra.
Mm-hmm.
And Esvedra is famous because it's the island that was purportedly the island of Odysseus fame. from the Odyssey. And the story is that this is the island where Odysseus had himself tied to the mast of his ship so that he could avoid listening, or he could listen to the sirens, but then not be tempted to go to his death with the sirens. And I'll say this, that while I was there, I was sort of like prodded to swim off the boat, because you can't really anchor right next to Esvedra because it's rocky, and you could basically lose the hull of your boat. So you have a bit of a swim to get to the rock. And it was unbelievable because like I jumped in, and there was a woman on the trip with us as well who literally was like a fish. She jumped off the boat and just like was a mermaid. She jumped right in, swam right up to the rock. She had no problems at all. I swam, and I got about halfway and I started getting super dizzy. Because this rock, Esvedra, which is this rock that juts up like hundreds of feet out of the water, is it's supposedly one of the most magnetic places on Earth. It's super magnetic. So you swim to it and you touch it because it feels like you're touching a power plant or something. But it has the effect that compasses don't work there. So like your compass is just like going around and around and weird stuff. It's like Bermuda Triangle type stuff. And so these sirens from the story of Odysseus were supposedly like mermaids, right? Who could play musical instruments and sing beautiful songs. And so, I'm swimming up to the island, and I end up getting 2 cramps in my legs. So here I am, and it's deep water, and there's no like life jackets or anything. I'm thinking, why didn't I bring a life jacket or something just in case, because it was cold water too, freezing cold. And I'm about halfway across, and I'm like totally losing my bearings, like disoriented. It was completely crazy. It was a bizarre experience. I'm like, great, this would be a great place to drown. I need to be saved by a mermaid, right?
Right. Yeah.
But I ended up making it, and I somehow pulled it together, and I ended up making it, and I touched the rock, and I can tell you, it did feel like it was electric, like totally electric. Now, this whole story comes right out of the Eleusinian mysteries. And I believe we live in a U inverse, that what's on the inside of us projects to the outside of us, and we're living like a hero's journey type game. And every day I'm living this thing, and it's like totally wild. And I came across this reference to the Eleusinian mysteries. And so you're bringing this up now is not a coincidence. So tell me about the Eleusinian mysteries and what exactly it is. It's got a lot of references similar to the Egyptian mystery schools.
Correct. Yeah. And so the Eleusinian mysteries started in about 2000 BC, right? And they went up until basically the 4th century AD, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and they wiped out the mysteries. So for almost 2,500 years, the Eleusinian mysteries were the mystery school, the main mystery school of ancient Greece. They had both a greater mysteries that happened once every 4 years, where the sort of elite were invited and participated, and they had lesser mysteries where it was more sort of broadly open to the general public of folks who could attend, and that would happen basically every year. And these mysteries occurred in Eleusis, which is about 20 to 30 miles outside Athens, and it's where a lot of the wheat fields were. So the goddess Demeter was very present in the Eleusinian mysteries, because Eleusis was where a lot of the wheat was grown. And that's why they think kykeon was made from ergot, because it's a fungus that grows on rye bread in these wheat fields. And they hosted these mysteries in something called the telesterion. So telesterion, the Greek root of that is telos, which I'm sure you know what that means. And so the telesterion was the sort of place that people went, and it could hold, I think, up to 3,000 people who would participate in these Eleusinian mysteries. And it told the story of Demeter and Persephone.
And Persephone, her daughter, right?
And Persephone was captured by Hades, and the negotiation that then had to take place in order for Persephone for Demeter to get Persephone back into the real world. And this, of course, was representative then of the sowing and the reaping, the cycles of ancient Greece. Now you had the other interesting thing about the mysteries is you could not talk about the mysteries on pain of death or excommunication. In other words, if you participated in the mysteries, you could not tell a single soul what happened in those mysteries, or you would be either killed or excommunicated for life outside of ancient Greece. So they were very mysterious. And what was written on the sort of the wall above the entrance arch into the telesterion was, to die before you die means you don't die when you die. So to die before you die means you do not die when you die. That was the quote that was on the arch. And that represented this initiation that was occurring as part of the mysteries that these people were committing to as they went in. And so it really was, I would say, the sort of bedrock of the mystery schools in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And when it was eliminated, the West really didn't have any context for psychedelic experiences until LSD was invented in 1938. So for nearly 1,600 years, we had absolutely, I would say, minimal experience with psychedelic substances, which was, why the 60s went down the way they went down.
I was born in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
The number one song the week I was born. The number one song the week I was born was "This Is the Dawning of the Age of Aquarius" by The Fifth Dimension. And by the way, that's another reference on Living in a Matrix. Go and look up the song, the number one song the week you were born. It will tell you something about you. It's really wild. It's like another way of looking at astrology. Oh yeah. Just look up Billboard number one song and put your date of birthday on there and Google it. And then you'll find what the song was and it'll tell you something about you.
Vision of Love by Mariah Carey was mine. That's actually very, very relevant.
That's pretty appropriate from what I know about you.
Right? Exactly.
So, yeah. So what was this exact brew of the Kykeon in the Eleusinian mysteries?
So Kykeon was made from ergot. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye bread. And ergot is the same sort of substrate that is
as
LSD was made from. Now, they believe that there were other herbs that were put in there as well because it was a potion. So there may have been, they assume there may have been some wine or some beer that the Kykeon was made in wine because this was very common in ancient Greece, that a lot of potions had a sort of base of wine. There were probably other herbs as well, but that's a little bit more unclear.
Did they ever do lotus?
Potentially blue lotus could have been part of the Kykeon because it was a very commonly used psychoactive in Egypt. And,
Egypt and
at
Greece
that point in time,
close.
They were very close. Now, when this was first talked about in the 60s and 70s, there was also discussion that it could be Amanita muscaria. And as you know, Amanita muscaria is from Russia. The active ingredient in Amanita muscaria is muscimol, which is an anxiolytic. And then there was also discussion.
Mean? So translate that for the
anxiolytic means
people here.
It helps with anxiety. So Amanita is the sort of classic toadstool, red and white mushroom, and you can take muscimol out of it, and it has helps with anxiety, but it doesn't have the same sort of visual or psychedelic quality that something like ergot would have. And they also thought that maybe it was psilocybin mushrooms. So there were three things. It was either ergot, psilocybin mushrooms, or Amanita muscaria. And there were a few people who worked on this in the 50s and 60s. One was R. Gordon Wasson. So Wasson was one of the first Westerners to go down to Mexico and work with psilocybin mushrooms. And he had a feature published on the front page of Life magazine. He was a banker for J.P. Morgan Chase. A guy named Albert Hoffman, who was the inventor of LSD, a Swiss chemist, and then a gentleman named Carl Ruck, who was a very eccentric professor in Boston, who first talked about this idea of the Eleusinian mysteries and first had the major proposal that the ancient Greeks did in fact work with psychedelics, which even in the 70s was not accepted and actually killed his career as a result. So the fact that this was talked about, the controversy surrounding it, that you had folks like Plato and Aristotle and Marcus Aurelius who were participating in these psychedelic experiences, has really only been accepted on a more wider basis in the last 5 years because of this book, The Immortality Key by Brian Myrrh, which, and I think your listeners will be really fascinated by this. In that book, Brian talks about this relationship between Dionysus. And so Dionysus was also one of the main Greek gods, the god of Bacchanalia, the god of wine, the god of the wild, the god of the forests.
The Roman
right?
name is Bacchus.
Right. Bacchus would be the Roman name. So it talks about...
And the Egyptian name is actually Osiris.
And talks about this relationship between Dionysus and Jesus. And then, in fact, the early communion of the Christian church before the Eleusinian mysteries were wiped out, the early communion of the Christian church actually had, let's say, psychedelic properties inside of it. And so it's a very controversial take. But if you look at the commonalities between Dionysus and Jesus, the long hair, the virgin birth, there are several others commonalities between Dionysus and Jesus. It's not so far-fetched to think that the Christian Jesus was sort of a evolution of Dionysus. And what was central to Dionysus and his sort of lore was these Eleusinian mysteries. So there's also a pretty direct tie between the Eleusinian mysteries and the development of the early Christian church.
Wow. Okay. All right. So then this is something that you believe started, as far as we know in recorded history, it was about 2000 BC.
Around there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And basically, all the philosophers that were the Greek philosophers, probably starting with, I guess the first Greek philosopher was Thales.
Mm-hmm.
And then Pythagoras was not long after that. We're talking about the 6th century BC. It was around the same time as Buddha, same time as Siddhartha.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you can kind of go through all the philosophers. Then you've got Plato, which was about 430. You've got 450 or 460, I believe, was Socrates.
Mm-hmm.
So probably all of these people were imbibing, I guess, on this Eleusinian, Kykeon brew. And probably awakening their consciousness to start thinking about philosophical thoughts.
Correct.
Well, and these are people that are credited with being some of the great minds of all of history.
Well, and there's a fantastic piece on this, which we'll have to link to in the show notes, that talks about this relationship between substance duality, which was a concept that was developed by Plato, which essentially said the mind and the soul are actually two different things. That the physical body can die and be decrepit, but that the soul is this sort of infinite essence that will continue to live on. And for anyone who has had a psychedelic experience before, that is one of the most profound insights that usually comes through, is this fear of death all of a sudden evaporates, because we come to recognize that our soul and our essence is something that will continue to go on past just our physical body. Plato developed that. It is believed that he developed that as a result of participating in the Eleusinian mysteries because of the experience that one would have in psychedelics. And that frame is actually the early precursor to Descartes' I think, therefore I am, right? The shift, though, was that we moved to a more biological lens, or purely biological or reductionist lens, when Descartes started to talk about it. So instead of it being the soul and the physical form, it became the mind and the body with Descartes, because the original meaning of psyche, and where we get psychedelic from, is, yes, mind manifesting, but the ancient Greeks thought of the mind as the soul more than anything. There wasn't a distinction necessarily between those two. And so some people would say that psychedelic actually means soul manifesting, and that it brings us back to this infinite, eternal essence that we often forget is part of our being.
Interesting. So it's almost as if when they went into this doorway of the psychedelic of Kykeon, somehow it awakens within them this knowledge of self in a new context. And so you end up with things like Plato's cave. Right. And this concept that maybe life as we know it is a bit of a reflection or a projection of some other place, whether it's a realm of forms or something else, right? Mm-hmm. Which is a very deep and philosophical way of looking at the world. And, just as in the Plato's cave allegory, he wants to go back and have everyone else understand this, but he's not able to get them to understand it. Right. And so that he's basically saying what you think you're living as your normal life is just a shadow of another existence.
Right.
And so there must be something about this Kykeon and about psychedelics that opens you up to see the world in a different way. So it's creating new neural pathways to be able to put together patterns of your life story and make sense and meaning of it in a new and novel way, at least in your mind.
And in a way that frees you from the, I would say, conditioning or imprint of, let's say, your immediate family or your community or your church or the ideas and perspectives that you believed were true because someone told you that they were true. And so all of a sudden then with a psychedelic, and Aldous Huxley used this metaphor beautifully, in normal waking life.
For those that don't know, Aldous Huxley was an author in the in the 20th century who wrote the book The Doors of Perception that became popularized by The Doors, the band, and Jim Morrison.
And also wrote Brave New World, which I would imagine a lot of listeners had to read in high school and things like that. And Aldous Huxley talked about the mind as a reducing valve. And this came from the French philosopher Henri Bergson. And so the idea of the reducing valve is that normal waking consciousness, we only can access, 7% of our brain or whatever it is. But when we take a psychedelic, all of a sudden that reducing valve of consciousness opens up, where the things in our subconscious and our unconscious can start to come forth and actually be lived out. And so all of a sudden then the emotions, the stories, the memories that we've repressed, the beliefs that we've taken on because our dad told us we had to, or our parents told us we had to, or our church told us we had to, all of a sudden we can start to see life from a much broader and richer lens, a much broader perspective, where we come to realize, oh, there are actually aspects and elements that I only believe because, my dad made me believe it, basically, or else I wouldn't be loved by him. And so we can let go of this conditioning. We can let go of these beliefs, which allows us to step into a much broader lens and a broader perspective. And so that's one of the beautiful aspects and elements of psychedelics is they truly do open the mind. And we can even see this with modern fMRI scans. If you look at a brain when it's taken psilocybin versus a brain on placebo doesn't have much connectivity between both hemispheres of the brain. A brain on psilocybin has a lot of connectivity. So it's actually making the brain more connected, more aware. And that connectivity is leading to a greater sense of self, a greater sense of connection to things outside of us. Also, to go back to your point, a greater recognition of our projections and the way that our beliefs influence the way that we live. And if we can change our beliefs, we can change our stories. If we can change our stories, we can change our lives. And what we see time and time again with psychedelics is because they change those projections, they allow us to take it back. They allow us to own and take responsibility over those projections and recognize ourselves as the ultimate creator. And that is the most powerful thing I think that they can do, is to help us remember that there is, as you said, it is a universe. There is no universe but the universe that is within us.
Right.
And the recognition of that is what the mystics have been talking about for thousands and thousands of years.
I don't know if you saw this, but I just posted on my Instagram page a few days ago a segment of a live that I did while I was in Ibiza. And someone had written on there saying, oh, it's the 13 bloodline families that have basically separated us all and made life miserable for all of us. And I said, I kind of stopped and I said, and for those of you that think that, you are controlled by these other people, right? The truth is, or the elites that, that you're controlled by the elites. The truth is you are the elites. If you think you're a victim, if you think that you've been handled and mistreated, if you think all these things, it's like you need to recognize that it's actually created from within you. Mm-hmm. And within me, the fact that you exist even is part of my matrix of mind. And that we are actually creators. And the moment that we can actually grasp that we're not just actors on some stage play, on someone else's stage play, but we are actually not just an actor, but we are a director, a producer. We're a playwright. Mm-hmm. And we're writing it real time. And what we call destiny is the free will of our higher self. And the higher self knows, because it's got the benefit of being outside of the dimension of time that's locked within. So this whole idea of being the co-creator of your universe and realizing that everything that projects back to you is there to trigger you, to awaken you to some part of yourself that you thought was separate from you, but is actually a part of you. And, as I look at this, I did a little chat GPT on this.
Yeah.
And it basically says the word kaikion comes from the ancient Greek verb kukao, meaning to stir or to mix. The term literally translates to mixture or stirred drink. It's basically an alchemical brew, reflecting its preparation as a blended beverage. In the context of the Eleusinian mysteries, kaikion was a sacred drink made from barley, so the beer, you just said, water, and sometimes pennyroyal, a mint-like herb. The drink is described in Homer's Iliad and hymn to Demeter as both a refreshing and sacred substance. While it was used in everyday life, its ritual use in the mysteries may have included psychoactive properties, possibly due to ergot, a fungus that grows on barley and contains compounds related to LSD, just as you said. So etymologically, kaikion signifies the act of transformation through mixing, aligning symbolically with the transformative nature of the Eleusinian mysteries themselves, guiding participants through spiritual stirring and awakening. I really like the stirring because this is all leading to alchemy and, what we later learn as alchemy, but it's all probably part of the same thing. It's the alchemy of us understanding the self and then having some transformation as a result of it. And this whole idea of these mystery schools being, punishable by death if you shared any information on them, right? That's very Pythagorean too. Pythagoras had the same kind of rules.
Well, and the stirring's an interesting point because for anyone who's taken a psychedelic, there can be a lot of good that comes from it. There can be insights, there can be awareness, there can be perspectives. It doesn't mean it always comes easy, though. That even
it stirs up some shit, if that's what you mean.
It stirs up some shit, It's like, and even in the brain scans reflect this. When you look at a brain that's under the influence of a psychedelic, there's this concept called the entropic brain theory, which is that when we introduce entropy into a brain, it can actually help to interrupt the default and rigid patterns that keep us constricted, that keep us depressed, that keep us addicted. And that by introducing that entropy, there is a new opportunity that opens up for neuroplasticity, for behavioral change. And so it's in the stirring, right, in the mixing, in the introduction of entropy or chaos that the real transformation of psychedelics can come through, because there's a recognition that things cannot be the same that they have been. That if I am actually to, let's say, get the most out of this experience, if I am actually to integrate this experience for beneficial means, both for myself and those around me, that I can't not take action on the lessons and learnings that come through, right? So there's this gap usually in development between awareness and action. And one of the hardest parts about psychedelics is they force you to confront certain aspects of your reality that are not so pretty. And if you don't do anything with that, it actually causes more distress than help. And so we are almost forced to face our demons, recognize that our demons are just another aspect of self, and actually transmute those demons into power, creativity, and capacity for change and for good. And I think that's one of the most beautiful parts about psychedelics is they are naturally destabilizing, right? This is why they can be risky. This is why, they're intimidating. This is why they require a really good set and setting. But if you direct that chaos, that mixing, that destabilization towards a creative orientation, they can be profoundly powerful in how they shift the fabric of our existence.
So it helps you become aware of your shadow and to integrate your shadow.
Right.
Which I think is very, very profound. Okay, so let's go from ancient Greece then. So then where's the next place that we see? I mean, if we're talking about 2000 BC, about 1300 BC would have been around the time of Moses.
Mm-hmm.
And Moses showing up in the Bible as having, the Ark of the Covenant was made of acacia wood. Acacia wood is a very common tree. If you go down to southern Egypt, to Aswan, I mean, it's almost kind of the only trees around on the islands on the Nile. It's rose granite and acacia. And acacia, you can smoke it, right? So basically Moses was having this, discussion with God where he gets the information that sets him out on his mission. And then also he gets the 10 Commandments. And when you think about this, like, was this all a psychedelic journey?
I mean, that's the hypothesis, right? That not only was there the acacia, but there was also Syrian rue. And Syrian rue is a plant, an MAOI, that when combined with acacia, so the active ingredient in acacia is DMT, right? Dimethyltryptamine, which is also the active ingredient in ayahuasca. And so the version that historians hypothesize that Moses may have consumed was acacia mixed with Syrian rue, acacia being the actual dimethyltryptamine and Syrian rue being the MAOI, because when you mix those together as a potion, the DMT when consumed can cross the blood-brain barrier and can instigate these visions of what a lot of people call samadhi, which is this feeling or sense of enlightenment. And we also know, as we've talked about, that, Moses was raised in ancient Egypt. So yes, he was a Jew, and yes, he was an Israeli, and yes, he led his people out of Egypt. But psychoactive substances were also pretty widely used by the elite in ancient Egypt. And so I think there's also an assumption that this may not have been the first psychedelic that Moses had consumed, that it may have been for a very particular purpose and reason and intention, that he did so, I would even say skillfully, was my sense. But I would be surprised if he hadn't experimented with blue lotus or psilocybin mushrooms at some point before that sort of burning bush, breakthrough that is so talked about in the Bible. And that's not the only psychoactive substance that was discussed in the Bible. I mean, even if you look at what the three wise men brought to Jesus at his birth.
Gold, frankincense, and myrrh.
Right. And both frankincense and myrrh are highly psychoactive. If smoked, which frankincense could be smoked, or myrrh was often sort of like an opiate-like substance that was woven into wine. So there's quite a few drugs in the Bible. I would say that just the most common one that we talk about is Moses and the burning bush with acacia and the Syrian rue.
So let's go back for a second on frankincense, because I'm kind of getting triggered on that in a positive way, because the three wise men were related to the three belt stars of Orion.
Okay.
And so frankincense would be the middle star if we just take the ordering of it. And that is supposed to be the Orion's Gate portal through which
Hmm.
souls come through, many believe, when they come to Earth. So what would be the psychoactive properties of frankincense?
I believe when it was burned, right, like almost as an incense, it has this anxiolytic effect. So similar to blue lotus. So the
Okay.
psychoactive properties of it would be more similar to. It's not psychedelic in nature necessarily. You're not necessarily going to see visions, but it would have a similar impact as blue lotus or some of these other psychoactive substances. Kana is another one that comes to mind. And that's why it was often used as an incense, not only why it was brought to Jesus, but also why it's been used as an incense in the Catholic Church, because consuming that helps to sort of calm things down.
Interesting. It says, I just looked it up, a significant compound in frankincense, which is insensol acetate, has
Mm-hmm.
been shown to affect the central nervous system. Research indicates that it activates the TRPV3 ion channels in the
Huh.
brain, which are involved in the perception of warmth and relaxation.
Right.
This activity is associated with the anti-anxiety, antidepressive, and mildly euphoric effects.
Mm-hmm.
It can also influence neural pathways linked to emotions, promoting feelings of tranquility and spiritual connection.
Right.
I didn't know this. Aromatherapeutic effects. The aromatic smoke of frankincense stimulates the limbic system, particularly the amygdala and hippocampus, areas involved in emotions and memory. It is believed to induce a meditative state, enhancing focus and spiritual introspection, which explains its historical use in religious rituals.
Mm-hmm.
It also has anti-inflammatory properties. So it's used in spiritual and ritual usage. It helps with mental health, and it's neuroprotective.
Mm-hmm. And yet, you're just discovering this yourself. It's like this has been used in the Catholic Church for what, probably 2,000 years,
Oh,
really,
yeah.
since the beginning of
Mm-hmm.
Jesus, right? So it's interesting how these, and you even have wine. We have wine obviously as part of communion. Myrrh is something that used to be put into this wine along with potentially psychedelic compounds. So that was one of the common uses of it. And myrrh is slightly different than frankincense in what it does. It's more of an opiate,
Yep.
more active on the opiate receptors compared to frankincense being more active on the sort of 5-HT1A, which has this anxiolytic effect. And then gold. A friend years ago gave me this whatchamacallit, like a homeopathic remedy of gold, like a tincture of gold that I would take on
Yep.
a pretty consistent basis. And so you can also consume gold, and gold, of course, represents wealth. It represents, beauty. It represents, all these sorts of things. So it's interesting that frankincense, myrrh, and gold were all given together to Jesus, who is this, archetypal character. And I think that's, I grew up in the Christian church, and of course, when growing up in the Christian church, you're taught Jesus is a real person, which may have been the case, but I think what's much more likely is he's an archetype that represents the sort of state of samadhi in Western culture, the state of enlightenment, and yeah. So I'll pause there.
So that's super interesting. So I tried gold because one of my friends who I did a podcast with is 19 Keys,
Mm-hmm.
and he basically gave me some of this gold that he basically manufactures, and it's kind of like a monatomic gold. You can take it
Right.
and you basically put it into water, and it dilutes it quite a lot, and you could try it, and it has lots of different properties of like anti-aging benefits, et cetera, et cetera. It increases the, it sort of increases your mental acuity as well. And a lot of people swear by it. So it is interesting that these are all, we don't think of it like that. We always just think, oh, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Well, if you really think about it, these were like anti-aging and
Right.
it's a mild hallucinogenic is what frankincense is classified as.
Mm-hmm.
It's a mild hallucinogen, and then you've got more psychoactive inside of the myrrh, which is more like an opiate.
Mm-hmm.
So it's fascinating because these things we don't really think much about. We just think, oh, it's like an incense, What does this even mean? So does this mean then that, I'll tell you for myself, I never tried any psychedelics. And I get this question all the time. So I started posting in 2019
Okay.
on social media, and I would post my geometry work. I was just drawing geometry. So for me, my whole spiritual path was through geometry. I didn't do anything with psychedelics until the last couple of years. And that was largely psilocybin, right? In the beginning, I would say. And I grew up in one of these households and one of these environments like, oh my gosh, you smoke one joint, you could die from that THC. It's like everybody, they did a really good job scaring the piss out of everybody in that one when I was in school.
Yeah.
But I have to say that the first time I tried mushrooms, I was like, what?
When you even made a comment at the conference we were at together, I think right after I spoke, that, it felt like it increased your IQ by like 25 points because all of a sudden these neural pathways and these perspectives came through. And I mean, how did it impact your perspective of math and sacred geometry? Did it have any influence there in terms of what you were able to sort of
what
recognize
it did? It actually, it put things in more context for me.
Okay.
Because I was kind of in this zone where I've always been able to see patterns. But now it wasn't just seeing the pattern, it was also applying what seeing the pattern actually meant and how that could be used in my life to change my perception. And I fundamentally started to believe that changing my perception would change my world. And it wasn't by changing the world. I mean, I spent my whole life trying to change the world around me and say, okay, well, the world would be good as I just have to succeed at this and then I'll be happy. Or I have to get married and then I'll be happy. Or I have to do this and then I'll be happy. And the truth is, you can't change the world by changing the world. You can only change your world by changing yourself.
Right.
And that's the paradox of all of this. That, I started realizing that everything I judged are the things I attracted. And it wasn't somebody else's fault. I couldn't blame someone else for it anymore. So I would say psilocybin got me there. But I was already getting my own natural DMT release just from drawing geometry.
Oh, interesting.
And I would go into deep meditative states by drawing geometry for like 20 hours on end. And I would do it tons and tons. So I was getting natural DMT just out of that and hitting samadhi states and everything just out of that. But what psilocybin did is it opened my heart. The DMT experience that I would get with geometry was one that was very personal, and I would experience samadhi, but it wasn't as heart opening as it was brain opening. And I was already pretty good at hemisynchronization because I've been a polymath pretty much my whole life.
Right.
So, the way you can get there is you can get there by balancing your brain, by taking the four quadrivium, right? And that's why they have the quadrivium, is so that each one is stimulating the brain in equal balance. I mean, if you're an athlete and you only work out your left side of your body, you're not going to be a very high performance athlete. You have to work out in balance, right? The balance part becomes critical, like the principles of Vitruvian man. So the same is true with our brain. That's why number in itself, or number in abstract, is arithmetic. Geometry is number in space. Music is number in time, and cosmology is number in space and time. And as we go, that's the fourth dimension, right? As we go into the fifth and sixth and higher dimensions, we're just going up the chakras. The fifth is the throat. Then you start to realize, wait, there's more here, right? The complexity increases, but then also the resolution is simplicity. You can't solve complex problems with greater complexity.
Right.
You can only solve the most complex problems with greater simplicity.
Right.
That's the problem in the world right now. We keep trying to solve problems that are complex with even greater complexity. The simple thing to change in the world is not the world around you. It's to simply change how you perceive your world. And by understanding the purpose of all of it, why we learn through duality, why we have to learn through opposites, actually helps you to make that shift. And I think psilocybin for me had a profound impact because it opened my heart and helped me to realize that the reason for being is just to love and be loved in return.
And this is where Mariah Carey's "Vision of Love," which was the #1 Billboard song, comes in, because this is
I had a vision of love.
This is the exact same sort of download I had 15 years ago, and why I started all this work in the first place. I was like, look, if there's one lever that I could help individuals pull or society pull that I think would dramatically shift not only their perspectives, but, as you've mentioned, really open their hearts. Because one of my favorite quotes that I've heard over the last year is, we don't have a resource problem, we have an empathy problem. And there's only so many problems that you can solve from the same level of consciousness that created them, that actually, to solve a lot of these complex problems that we're now faced with and dealing with, requires a new lens, requires a new approach. And I think that is coming back into the heart and a sense of love and compassion and empathy, still being clear and decisive and creative with our brain, but, as you talked about, bringing things back into balance. Because not only do our brains need to be balanced, our entire sense of self has to be balanced, right? We've learned in the last 10 years, we don't just have one brain, we have three brains, right? We have the brain, we have the heart, and we have the gut. And so how do we balance those, right? The mind, the heart, and the will, or the spirit, to create. And I find that psychedelics, they help with neuroplasticity, they help with empathy and opening the heart, and they're also anti-inflammatory. They help with chronic inflammation in the gut. 90% of our serotonin receptors are in the gut, and psychedelics are largely serotonergic. So they're active on all three. They help us to sort of remember what it takes to be whole in that way. And only once our cup is filled and we're whole can then we go out and really help other people. Can we get out of our own way and start to be of service rather than of just taking. All right, how do we go from me to we?
I think it also helps make the transition from human doing, which is what we've been all doing for the last 2,000 years, to human being.
Right.
And it puts us into the now to notice patterns in ourself. And so the now is the heart space. The fourth chakra is for the fourth dimension. The heart, and inside the Great Pyramid, the King's Chamber is actually the heart chakra chamber. That chamber is a clock, revealing that there are 48 constellations that are etched into the walls, and it's basically giving us the two-way nature of time, that we go forward in procession of equinox, and yet we go backward in precession of equinox at the same time. So it's already a Mobius strip. So just don't look at your watch and realize that we're going backwards through the zodiac as we go forward toward the next month.
Huh.
It's literally a Mobius strip that's going both directions, which is a mind blower.
One, in a way, it speaks, just to bring this full circle, into psychedelics, because the way we go forward is actually by going backwards. That the future of how we work with psychedelics is actually how we've always been using them for thousands and thousands of years before the invention of the FDA and psychotherapy and depression and all of these sort of modern lenses. That a lot of it is the retrieval of these ancient practices, right? The community aspect, the fact that this was, you didn't go work with psychedelics and then tell everyone on social media plus their uncle and cousin. You kept it kind of private and secret because there was a sacred and a reverence with it. So a lot of these ways in which psychedelics have been used for thousands of years, we actually have to go back if we want to have a foundation for how we go forward in building what's to come.
That's interesting you said. I fundamentally believe that the nature of time is such that the past determines the future. That's easy for people to understand, but the future determines likewise the past simultaneously. One is entangled to the other. That means that actually it's more like a Mobius strip, that we're going forward and backwards at the same time, and we are only seeing the one-way nature of time until we understand the 24,000-year clock. We don't understand that time actually goes backwards. We go forward in procession, which is 1 degree for every day of the 1 degree of a circle of the our trek around the sun. But then in precession, every 66 years, 66.6 years, 666, we're actually going backwards 1 degree for a total of a 24,000 year cycle. And this continues over and over and over again. So in this context, what we consider is our distant future is likewise our distant past.
Is this similar to what Nietzsche spoke about then with the eternal return or the eternal recurrence?
Yeah.
I just looked up what a Mobius strip is because I was not, and MC Escher, who's a really cool painter, has actually a painting that depicts this. And
in time, I haven't seen his painting of. It's related to time.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm not the only one that believes this. This is like there's a lot of people that believe this.
Yeah. And a Mobius strip, maybe your listeners know this, but it's a one-sided surface with a single edge formed by taking a rectangular strip of paper, giving it a half twist, and joining the ends together. And it was independently discovered by 2 German mathematicians in 1858.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
So this is, even the old depictions of the aeon of time, right? Which was a god, a Greek god, but also recognized in Roman mosaics. And the aeon of time shows time going as a Mobius strip, literally twisting. And this is how I believe it truly is. And we're just not seeing it. And becoming awakened means that we start to become awakened to these higher dimensional aspects. That time is not only going these, forward direction, the forward arrow of time, but as we go forward, we're also going backwards, just as we do in the sky. When we look at the constellation, this is why we go from Aquarius, to Pisces, and then Pisces into Aries, and Aries into Taurus, and Taurus into Gemini, Gemini into Cancer, Cancer into Leo. And yet, in precession, we actually go backwards. We went from Pisces into Aquarius. And so that means that the next one will be Capricorn. And the next one after that will be Sagittarius. So we literally are going backwards and forwards at the same time. And this is what Plato was trying to tell us in his great year. So the knowledge of how time actually operates is part of the 5th dimensional awareness. And everything that I believe was in our history that was in higher dimension than 4th dimension is hidden until we can perceive at that level. We're in dimensionally limited avatars at a 4th dimensional level. So that means that we're now becoming aware of our ancient history that was 5th dimensional level. We can't become aware of it because we can't perceive higher dimension until we can perceive higher dimension. If you're in the flat world and you try to explain what a depth perception is, when you don't even have vocabulary to describe what it is.
Right.
You have an apple fall through your flat world, you're just going to see slices of an apple fall through your world. Flat slices. But actually, someone who can perceive at a higher level, and that's what I believe psilocybin and what I believe psychedelics do, allow you to create the brain mechanics, the neural pathways, the synaptic junctions that allow you to perceive at a higher level by putting together this matrix of pattern. Did you know that there's a new love affair with mathematics and geometry happening all around the world today? People who once despised these subjects in high school are now finding they're falling in love with them. Do you know why? Because math without meaning is simply information, whereas math with meaning is divine communication. My courses, The Etymology of Number and The Language of Light, guide you on a journey of self-discovery, sharpening your problem solving and pattern perceiving, as well as analytical and creative thinking, and unlocking your fullest polymathic potential. And most importantly, acquainting you with the mathematical language of the universe itself. You will never see the U inverse the same again. To get started, I recommend The Etymology of Number, a 4-part series that explores the evolution of numbers and their impact on fields like physics, chemistry, music, and art. It is the embodiment of Leonardo da Vinci's encouragement to study the science of art and the art of science. Learn how to see. Realize that everything connects to everything else. My second course series, The Language of Light, is a 6-part series that builds on concepts from the first course and offers deeper insights into unified sciences, ancient wisdom, spirituality, and their relevance to today. My courses are always fun and easy to understand. They intertwine mathematics, music, art, and consciousness, and illuminate the mathematical connections that span all disciplines of science and art. Register for these 2 courses, Etymology of Number and Language of Light, at robertedwardgrant.com under the Courses tab. And join the Robert Edward Grant community chat on Orion Messenger for lively, engaging, and innovative discourse.
And one of the best examples of this is synesthesia, which is the capacity to taste sounds or hear colors, right? That when you're when you're sort of in a psychedelic experience, there is a capacity to experience life in a way that is totally unique. That actually the imprint of that helps to create a language. So when you come out of it, you're like, oh, this is what I experienced. This is why, even the Mobius strip, I get it because I've worked with psychedelics so much. I've been in those states that I'm like, if I hadn't had that, I would have really no idea what it's talking about. But because I have, I'm like, oh, I have a language for it. And I feel like that to me is one of the most important things that you've emphasized. It's like, how do we as a culture develop the language to be able to integrate these higher dimensional properties? Because not everyone is going to be, a polymath. And yet we all as humans have the capacity to experience these higher states. The problem is that mainstream religion is now performative. There's nothing enlivened about it. So when the Eleusinian mysteries were cut out, the Christian church just said, drink the communion, eat the bread, say the prayers, but you're not actually going to experience what it's like to be divinity yourself. And so I think part of bringing psychedelics back into the picture is enlivening these spiritual states so more people can access these higher dimensions and finally grok this capacity to go beyond industrial linear time that we have been beholden to for the last 300 or 400 years in industrialism. And I think has in large part created this human doing. And being able to step outside of that allows us to once again accept this concept of us as human beings, which is critical.
Absolutely right. So I want to shift gears for a moment. So what are the different psychedelics that are, because I think you did such a great job presenting on this at our conference up in Prince Edward Island. What are the different types of psychedelics and what do they do? If you could just kind of give us an overview of, people have probably heard of things like ketamine and they probably heard of, different, you mentioned wachuma, right? We talked about acacia, ayahuasca, each of these have sort of differences, some of them very significant, some of them more subtle. And if you could, kind of explain, or even DMT just by itself, that's another thing that I think is that's also worth really mentioning. So what are the classifications and what are their properties and what do they do specifically?
So the 3 main types of psychedelics are tryptamines, which are things like DMT, dimethyltryptamine, psilocybin, which is the ingredient in magic mushrooms, is a tryptamine. You have lysergamides, the most common one being LSD, and you have phenethylamines. And phenethylamines are things like mescaline, which is found in San Pedro or wachuma, also found in peyote. Also MDMA is a phenethylamine. So those are the 3 main types of psychedelics: tryptamines, lysergamides, and phenethylamines. Ketamine, which is legal and medically available. It's been approved by the FDA to treat depression. You can get it off-label pretty much anywhere in the United States, if not the world at this point. It's a very common anesthetic that's been used in emergency rooms since the 1950s. Ketamine is a dissociative. So the way that it interacts with the brain...
It's legal. So ketamine is legal everywhere in the United States?
Everywhere in the United States, for sure. It's used globally in the emergency room. And so it can be prescribed off-label. It's like one of, if not the most common medication in the world because of how inexpensive it is to produce. And it wasn't until about 30 years ago that its psychoactive properties were discovered, partly through John Lilly, who was the guy who invented the flotation device, the float tank device, but then also through doctors who noticed that they would put people under on ketamine and they'd come out less depressed and less suicidal. And they were wondering what was going on. So ketamine's only 90 minutes to 2 hours as an experience. It's really good for suicidality or depression. The challenge with ketamine is it's really easy to use it or overuse it, or for lack of a better term, abuse it, because it can be addictive. You can do, nasal sprays. I see this now in more social scenes where people are like, I don't drink alcohol, but they do ketamine all the time. And it
we don't in the 60s. I was born in 69. In the 60s, people always talked about drug, sex, and rock and roll.
Right.
We replaced drug, sex, and rock and roll with medicine, divine union, and festivals.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's a rebrand,
it's a rebranding.
It's a good rebrand.
I don't drink alcohol, but I'm like high on ketamine all the time. Right?
All the time, right? So I think ketamine you have to be careful with it, to not do it too often, but it can be a very useful substance. I think, the other ones that are most commonly talked about are LSD. LSD was invented in 1938, started to be utilized in 1943. A lot of people are intimidated by LSD because of the stories that they've heard from the 50s and 60s of people jumping out of windows or having bad trips. The thing to keep in mind with LSD is that it's very potent. Very, very. It is the most potent psychedelic because its potency is measured in micrograms. So there's 1,000 micrograms in a milligram. There's 1,000 milligrams in a gram. Most drugs are psychoactive at the milligram, if not gram level. LSD is psychoactive at the microgram level.
So what would be like a normal dose of LSD then for someone? It would just be a normal dose.
Yeah, a normal dose would be about 100 micrograms. That's sort of a normal starting dose. A microdose would be about 10 micrograms of LSD. So a little bit less, about 1/10 of a regular dose. LSD is more dopaminergic than psilocybin, so more dopamine with LSD. So oftentimes the people who are most attracted to LSD are people who are more cognitive, more intellectual. They notice that LSD helps them for brainstorming, helps them to be more creative. It's no coincidence that LSD was one of the most influential things that Steve Jobs did. In fact, if you look at the history of LSD, it was highly influential in the development of Silicon Valley and the computer revolution. The guy who invented the computer mouse, Douglas Engelbart, talked about his use of LSD. Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and was part of the acid test with the Grateful Dead, he took LSD from the lab in Stanford and brought it all over Palo Alto. So there's a very distinct relationship between cyberculture and the LSD of the counterculture. And LSD is my favorite. LSD makes me feel like how I should always feel. It's a hell of an antidepressant. My sex life is amazing. When I do it at higher doses, I can just go hiking for hours and hours. I find it to be fantastic, but you need to make sure that if someone is going to do it, that they have a safe quality source, that you test your substances, and that you do it with a friend, because it can be quite potent. And then you have psilocybin mushrooms. Psilocybin mushrooms are the oldest psychedelic. We've been using them probably for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. There's over 200 species of psilocybin mushrooms in the world. Psilocybin mushrooms, the active dose is anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5 grams. Some people will go up to 3, 4, 5 grams. There's been a lot of clinical research on psilocybin for everything from nicotine addiction to alcoholism to depression to OCD. It's shown to be very effective because of the mixing that we talked about earlier. It introduces chaos into the brain. It mixes up the usual patterns, so the brain isn't as constricted. It interrupts something called the default mode network, which is our normal patterning. So psilocybin does a great job of doing that. And it's the most widely available. So last year in the United States, 8 million people took psilocybin mushrooms, and about 4 million of those were microdosing with psilocybin mushrooms. And a microdose is anywhere from like 100 milligrams to 200 milligrams. So again, about 1/10 to 1/20. And then I would say the other two most common are ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is a tea from the Amazon that's a mix of a leaf and a vine. The leaf has DMT in it. It's called, I believe it's called chacruna, and the vine has MAOI in it, and that's copy is what they call the vine, B copy. So you mix the chacruna with the copy, and that gives you ayahuasca. That's been used. There's archaeological evidence of probably for about 1,000 years. Ayahuasca has been used, and now it's becoming much more kind of common in the West as people go down to Costa Rica and the jungle to work with it. And the thing is with ayahuasca, you want to make sure you have a shaman, someone who has been trained from an indigenous lineage. Ayahuasca is not to be done at home alone. It's a very potent substance. It has a lot of cosmology around it. It's highly recommended to work with a proper shaman who's been trained in an indigenous lineage. And then the last one that I'll mention is 5-MeO-DMT. So 5-MeO-DMT, different than regular DMT, which is in ayahuasca. 5-MeO is actually found most commonly in two forms, in something called yopo, which is an Amazonian snuff that is often used in conjunction with ayahuasca. And it's also found in the venom of the Sonoran desert toad. So you essentially milk a toad, dry its venom, and smoke it. And it's one of the most intense psychedelic experiences. How they discovered that, I have no clue. But that's been common in the last 20 years.
It's straight from the stuff on the outside of its skin, right?
Yeah, you turn it around, you sort of massage it. It's kind of like, you massage the toad, and then eventually the venom starts to come out from it. But you can also do it synthetically. There's now a synthetic version of 5-MeO.
Idea in the first place. It's like, it's such a crazy concept. So I can understand why, maybe some people believe that primates started eating mushrooms and they became sentient.
Right.
That part I could get, but it's like, who came up with the idea of like, let's like rub this toad? And
it's the same thing with ayahuasca. Who came up with the idea that, okay, if I mix this leaf with this vine for hours and hours, I'm going to have this psychoactive potion. And what the indigenous peoples of the Amazon say is the plants told them, right? And so I think this is an interesting lens that could have happened with the toad as well. The toad was talking to someone and said, you should milk me. So I think,
which other drug were they taking when the toad started talking to them? That's what I want to know.
Ketamine. It sounds like a ketamine thing for sure.
So ketamine, let's go back for a second to ketamine, because
let's do it.
Ketamine is becoming, like you said, it has the potential of becoming more recreational.
Right.
It's kind of replacing in a lot of circles. Obviously people are already like very self-righteous, indignant about, I don't drink alcohol, but I do ketamine type of thing. I only do psychedelics. And I find it to be the dissociation of it is very unique in that it dilates time.
Mm-hmm.
It totally changes your perception of time, which is interesting in and of itself, because you could literally find it. The one thing that I do like about ketamine, especially, is that it literally allows you to dive into. It's almost like that movie Lucy, where Lucy could see all the wavelengths, and then she went like this with the wavelengths, and she would expand those wavelengths. And it's like you could do that when you're on ketamine. You just go like this, keep going like this, and expanding your reality. And you could go into an atom, and then go inside that atom, and then go inside the black hole that's at the center of that atom. And then you could get sucked into that black hole, right? It's literally like this very, very bizarre experience that I can't apply to anything else. And it only lasts for like 45 minutes to an hour, I would say. That's kind of a normal, unless you're in what they call a K hole, right? Which is something totally different. But nowadays people pair it with a journey, which is music and sometimes a light show type of a thing. But you can close your eyes and you get this incredible light show inside your mind as well. And so what
like
exactly?
Meditation. I love the word meditation, right? It's like people will meditate or they'll have a sound show with the ketamine. Sorry.
Yeah. And so I have found that to also be, very powerful, but I do agree that it's getting kind of overused.
And I think it can be very powerful. It's a great introduction to psychedelics for someone who may be more hesitant or unsure, because they can do it.
It's in and
a clinic.
Out fast. Yeah.
It's in, 90 minutes tops including the sort of going through the full experience, coming out of it. It is a very different experience than the classic psychedelics. There's this sense of whenever I've done a high dose of ketamine, I feel like I'm almost the observer, and I'm just fully taking a step back, and I can sort of look at, like, I remember my last ketamine experience, I felt like I was sort of on the bottom of the universe, just watching everything go by. And it was really interesting. And it can be a really good reset, I've found. You're not going to get the same depth oftentimes as with psilocybin or LSD or ayahuasca because it's not as long or as intense. But for folks who are new to it, it's a great starting point. And for folks who are more experienced, but maybe have been having some challenges or some struggles, like I know folks who maybe do a journey just once every 3 months with ketamine because it's a nice reset button for stress and other things like that. The risk, of course, as we've already talked about, is you can easily get prescribed a nasal spray. It's really easy to do ketamine at parties, at home, basically wherever, because it's not so psychedelic or psychoactive that it's going to put you out. But I will say I've heard more than a few stories, including the one that was publicized with Matthew Perry, about people who have
to ask that. Mm-hmm.
People who have done ketamine in saunas, in pools, in baths, and they end up drowning or they end up suffering from, cardiac arrest or because ketamine is a dissociative. So it's very important.
Is that what happened to Matthew Perry? He drowned?
He drowned. Yeah. Because he was in a pool in a hot tub and he did way too much and ended up drowning in the pool. And I just had another dear friend about 6 weeks ago in Ibiza who also looks like passed away in a sauna, and it may have been related to ketamine use as well. So I think it's very important that people, if you're doing, especially because I know in the wellness community, saunas are very popular now and cold plunges are popular, do not mix ketamine with these other things. It can be very risky. If you're going to do ketamine, do it occasionally and, just on a couch or in your home.
What would be I don't understand, why would someone want to be in a bathtub on ketamine, especially the type of doses that I believe I read that Matthew Perry was engaging in. They were pretty high doses of ketamine. You're pretty much incapacitated.
Correct.
You might be conscious, but you're totally incapacitated.
Well, which is how they end up dying, because when you take enough ketamine, you cannot move, right? You have no capacity to move any of your limbs. And people will do it in a bathtub because it's more relaxing, and then they'll overdo it or they'll take too much. They get a little, let's say, cocky, and they end up doing way too much, and all of a sudden they're incapacitated. They're conscious, but they are literally drowning.
Can't move
because they can't move. So it's really not worth it at all. High doses of psychedelics and water and heat do not mix.
Wow. Okay. That's really fascinating. So what about things like GHB?
So GHB is, I would say, more of a party substance. It can be used intentionally for intimacy. So then we get into the conversation around like what I call the skill of psychedelics. So depending on the intention that you have, right? Someone's intention might be to heal a clinical issue like depression. Another person's intention might be to brainstorm a new idea. Another person's intention could be to reconnect with their spouse or partner or loved one. That will determine the substance and how much of that substance you choose to use. So I find with GHB, a lot of people will do it to help with intimacy. The risk, again, with GHB, just like with ketamine, is that it can be very addictive. So some people will do ketamine, and then to help them wind down and be able to sleep at night, they'll do GHB. And so I think the risk with GHB is that, again, it's done too often. It can be highly addictive. And so if someone is going to work with GHB, just have parameters, have boundaries. Don't do it too often, and don't mix it with any other central nervous system depressants, obviously. So don't mix it with alcohol, because if you mix alcohol and G, it could be, you won't remember much potentially.
Are there certain medicines that just should not be used together? For example, right, MDMA with something else.
So ayahuasca is the most particular of the substances because of the MAOI. that's in ayahuasca. So if someone is wanting to go on an ayahuasca experience, you have to be off all psychiatric pharmaceuticals. You cannot be on Prozac, Zoloft, Lexapro. You can't be on Adderall, Ritalin, Wellbutrin. All psychiatric pharmaceuticals have to be off before you do ayahuasca. Now, I'm not giving anyone permission to do this alone. If this is of interest, work with a medical professional, let them know about your intentions, and be supported in that way. MDMA as well, not good to mix with other psychiatric pharmaceuticals. So if someone's listening to this and they're interested in psychedelics, but they're on an SSRI, they're on a medication for ADHD or anxiety, the best one to start with is ketamine, because ketamine is not contraindicated with most psychiatric medications. MDMA you shouldn't do before an ayahuasca experience. You definitely should not do them together because of the MAOI that's in ayahuasca. If you do also MDMA, it will cause serotonin syndrome. That's the biggest risk.
What is serotonin syndrome?
Serotonin syndrome is when there's too much serotonin that's released, and it can cause basically blacking out. It can cause anhedonia, like total loss of mood and energy. If it's bad enough, it can cause even death. And so serotonin syndrome is just when there's way too much serotonin.
Too much serotonin.
Correct. You can die from too much serotonin. Yeah. So you want to avoid that at all costs. I would say beyond that, like some combinations that I really love and that are quite popular are what's called a hippie flip, which is combining psilocybin with MDMA. A lot of people love to take those together. There's also something called a candy flip, which is combining LSD with MDMA. Which is also fun. And then one other one that I haven't talked about yet, that's one of my favorites, is something called 2CB. And 2CB is another chemical that was invented by this guy, Sasha Shulgin. He invented MDMA. He also invented 2CB. He also invented like 200 other psychedelics as well. And 2CB is somewhere a mix between LSD and MDMA. It's about 4 hours in length. It's, I think, best used as an aphrodisiac. And it's very light, it's very loving, it's very heart opening. The challenge with MDMA, I find, is sometimes it can be too stimulating because it has that methamphetamine component and it'll keep people up late at night. They won't sleep so well. They'll be a little hungover the next day.
So MDMA has methamphetamine in it as well?
Yep.
Is this why you shouldn't take MDMA with amphetamines?
I would not take MDMA I wouldn't take any amphetamines with a psychedelic. I think the only time that might be appropriate is if you take a very low dose to help with a bad experience, right? If someone is like going comatose and can't quite come out of it, then some sort of stimulant could be helpful. But other than that, I wouldn't recommend, taking Adderall at the same time that you take a psilocybin experience, because it will dramatically impact the quality of that experience.
And what about sassafras?
So sassafras, the common term for that is MDA. MDA does not have that methamphetamine component like MDMA does. They're very similar. I would say MDA, which is also known as the love drug, is more of a heart opener. And it doesn't have the same type of like stimulation or jaw clenching that MDMA does. So MDMA, or I'm sorry,
it
MDA
doesn't
really
seem to
nice.
have the crash either. Maybe because it doesn't have the
Not
methamphetamine.
as bad of a crash because it's not dumping as much dopamine and oxytocin as MDMA is.
So you get a bunch of dopamine with MDMA and oxytocin that you don't get with MDA. But MDA does give you the same heart opening.
It has more oxytocin.
More oxytocin. Interesting. Yeah. Huh. So be careful if you take MDA and you're with your partner, you might fall in love.
Well, I say that like if you're dating someone and you're not totally sure if you really want to make that a thing, don't do psychedelics with them, because if you take MDMA with someone you're dating, you're going to fall in love pretty quick, and so you got to be at times. Or on the other end of the spectrum, if you really like this person and they really like you, I found psychedelics on like the third or fourth date are a really great way to know someone better and really just have heart-opening conversations that allow you to just be honest and open and authentic and not feel the need to hide things from someone.
Okay, I'm going to go there. What about sex?
So Timothy Leary used to say that LSD was one of, if not the best aphrodisiac on the planet, and I've talked to a lot of people who have used lower doses of LSD as well as lower doses of psilocybin mushrooms to help with their sex life, to help with intimacy, to help open things up. MDMA can also be a great way for greater intimacy and connection. The downside with MDMA is it's very difficult for men to get erect and for women to get wet if they're taking MDMA. So if someone is taking MDMA, it's really nice for intimacy and for cuddling. But if they also want to have sex, I find that a little bit of cannabis after an MDMA journey can be a really great way to get the juices flowing for some hot and heavy lovemaking. So they're fantastic. I think the main thing
is that because also of the methamphetamine
in the MDMA, that's a good, I don't know. That's a good question. It might be because it's too much serotonin. And if you have too much serotonin, the feel-good molecule, it can make you just a little too gooey. That's what people experience with MDMA. They feel like their heart's really open, but they don't have sort of the edge or the drive to like get hard and go after it.
Interesting. So which ones do you like the most then?
LSD is my favorite. It's the one I used the most when I was 19 and 20. It's the one that I feel is ideal for my sort of brain chemistry. I mostly do low doses of LSD at this point in time. I also work a lot with ayahuasca. So if I'm doing like proper, what I would call medicine work or journey work, ceremonial work, I prefer ayahuasca. I love working with the indigenous curanderas of the Amazon. I think the ceremony and ritual that surrounds it is really beautiful. And it's a really great detox and cleansing. And then I've been exploring more and more San Pedro or Wachuma as a microdose, because San Pedro, out of all of the psychedelics, is the most anti-inflammatory. And so it has really incredible benefits on sort of chronic inflammation and overall inflammation in the gut and the heart and the brain. And so I've been exploring more and more San Pedro because it has some of that same stimulation that LSD does, but it doesn't have the same level of gooiness that psilocybin does. I find with mushrooms, sometimes I'm just so in my heart and so in my body that it's hard for me to really be present and active, that I almost need to have like my own space to go into my emotions. With San Pedro, I can still be more active, but grounded. The challenge with LSD is it sometimes makes me too heady. And so
what is a bad trip on LSD? What causes the bad trip?
The most common cause of a bad trip is not having a great set and setting. So set is short for mindset. Setting is the environment in which you do it. And folks who typically have bad experiences with high doses of LSD or other psychedelics is they do them at raves or festivals while they're drunk or on other drugs. They do it, maybe by themselves, and they do way too high of a dose to start with, and they don't have the support there that they need to help them come down. Those are the two most common. People who are just doing it in a setting that's not ideal, or they don't really have the capacity to take the amount that they take. They just way overdo it. That's why I tell folks, start low, go slow. You can always take more. You can't necessarily take less. There's no harm in like starting with a microdose or a low dose, feeling into it, and then continuing to go up from there. The most common reasons people have a bad trip is because they don't do it in a great setting, or they just take way too much of it, and they don't have the capacity.
Yeah, that's one I like every time I've talked to somebody that had a bad experience with mushrooms, for example, I find out it's because they had some massive dose their first time.
Right.
And what usually happens is they're like, try some, and they don't see an effect for like 30 minutes or 45 minutes or something. And then they're like, oh, I'm going to eat some more. And then they go and get more, and then they do it again. And then finally they're like going to get tanked because they basically just eaten like 5 grams. I talked to a guy who did this with 8 grams for his first time. I would never, ever, ever want to do mushrooms again if that was my first experience. 8 grams.
Mm-mm.
I mean, literally, it's way too high. You should be on, something less than, for a first time, I would say something less than a gram.
Correct. Less than a gram. And be there with a friend. At least have someone who's there to support you, who can, potentially help you walk through it. And there's no need to go higher, because you can always do another experience and take 2 grams the next time or 3 grams the next time.
Yeah.
There's no reason to go above a gram
exactly.
if it's your first time.
No, you'll have a good experience. And also for intimacy, it's great. At that level, you're just going to have a really good experience. It can be ceremonial. It can be beautiful. You'll start noticing the colors and everything, but it's not going to overtake you.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas, if you go in with like 5 grams or 4 grams or something, that's like your face is feeling like it's melting off.
Uh-huh.
And then you become totally in a different world. And I've seen people that are very happy with 1 gram and 2 gram, all of a sudden go to a dark, dark side of the mushroom experience at 4 grams or even less than 5 grams. I've seen that happen. And it just freaks some people out. So it's all about the dose. It's all about set and setting. What is your intention behind it as well?
And
Intention.
I think the other thing, the intention is what you come back to, and the breath is what helps you anchor in that intention. So oftentimes when we have a practitioner training program where I train coaches and doctors and therapists on how to work with psychedelics. And one of the key skills that we always teach is meditation and breath work. That these are part and parcel of learning how to navigate psychedelic experiences, because one of the main reasons these bad trips happen is because people start to get paranoid. They start to trip out. They start to hyperventilate. Their nervous system becomes dysregulated, right? If you can just learn how to breathe, like we did right before we got on the podcast, a little box breathing, right? To calm the nervous system down, remembering to breathe deep into the diaphragm in the midst of having a challenging experience can be a game saver, right? It can really help to re-regulate the nervous system. So whenever I'm coaching people or helping prepare them for an experience, I always do breath work with them to help them anchor into the importance of coming back to the breath. They feel like the emotions are too much to handle. If it's getting too chaotic, if things are getting too crazy, come back to the breath. The breath is always the anchor.
Orion is unique. No algorithms, no propaganda, and no exploitation. Just end-to-end quantum secure data. Messages, groups, and shared media behind a wall of next generation encryption. Absolutely. So, what are the key watch-outs that you think that people really need to understand if they're going to basically be doing this? Because
right.
I believe that as long as, now having been on the other side of this, 3 years ago, I would have answered this very differently. Today, I would say to you that it has dramatically increased my IQ.
Mm-hmm.
And it has also dramatically shifted my way I look at the world. And when you change the way you see things, the things you see change.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something very profound. It allows you to more easily be able to be an observer of yourself, of the world around you, and be able to put together patterns. And so it definitely connects you to spirit very, very closely. Mm-hmm. For me, it was always about the spiritual aspect of this. And I realized as well that to understand higher science, you have to understand the higher spirituality. It's through the doorway and portal of spirituality that we can actually get access to this field of information from the universe. And that's how it's always been since the beginning of time. And people have gotten there through different means. I heard one of the ways that Einstein did it was he would hold these 2 ball bearings and he would fall asleep and take a nap in the afternoon until the ball bearings would fall into a metal pan. And then the moment he would be there with the metal pan, he'd have on his lap a notebook and a pencil. So that as he has basically just been in this alpha mode of, in between sleep state and awake, almost like a hypnosis state, mm-hmm. he would wake up instantly and write down all of his ideas. Mm-hmm. We all can get there different ways where we can actually get access to the divine. Mm-hmm. And also in partnership and in union, these different psychedelics have this very powerful impact. I tried Wachuma for the first time in Peru. Mm-hmm. And we were on a hike. It was probably it was like 8 or 9 mile hike or something. It was like an incredibly long hike. And it was beautiful, but it took a long time as well for that to basically kick in.
Right.
We had to drink a lot of that brew
right.
to have it kick in. It was not like an ayahuasca type of an experience at all. Mm-hmm. Right. So each one has their own properties. Do your research. Make sure, there's only one person who's going to be responsible for you, and that's going to be you.
Right.
So, and just not having a cavalier attitude about this stuff also, that it is sacred. And once you start treating it that it's not sacred, then you've sort of lost the plot.
And it could come back to bite you in the ass. That's the other thing, that, to use these with reverence, to use these with respect, to recognize the sacred nature of them, it's not an ego trip. In fact, it's the opposite, right? So to start low and go slow, to realize and recognize that you can always deepen, but if you go too deep, you can't come back. And so I think that's oftentimes people, they come into it, many people with good intentions, but if it's not done skillfully, if it's not done with professional support, I mean, that's usually what I tell folks as well. Find a coach, a guide, a therapist, a practitioner. If you're doing this for the first few times, especially if you're doing higher doses or working with higher doses, have someone in your corner who can support you, who can prepare you, who can be there for you, who can help you integrate afterwards, because these are not run-of-the-mill experiences. These require sometimes mentorship or supervision or some coaching or therapeutic support as part of them as well. So, and then be in community. This is, a lot of us think, oh, I'll just do this by myself, and, very individual. But part of the beautiful aspect of working with psychedelics is being with others, whether that's in a big group ceremony or with friends hiking or, with a loved one, with a partner, right? There's a really beautiful aspect of being in community when working with these substances. I think it just speaks to sort of the ancient use as well. This is how we've been using them for thousands and thousands of years, is in community, is in groups. And I find that's often the most transformative for folks who are starting to work with psychedelics. So start low, go slow, find professional support. I would even say go to Third Wave, my website, thethirdwave.co. I have a podcast, which we got to get you on, and we'll be scheduling that soon. We have a newsletter. We have tons of free guides. We have courses and trainings. Like, if this is something you're interested in, do your research, learn a little bit more, right? Prepare yourself, and then trust. Set it up in such a way where you can just trust and let go and surrender. Because that's the sort of letting go process is where a lot of the magic happens when we start to work with these higher doses of psychedelics.
So 2 last questions. One is about legality, right? And which states, et cetera, in the United States, and maybe a few list of some major countries, would be good to kind of know what the current status is for these different psychedelics. I will say this, that, I've taken mushrooms around with me, very small doses of mushrooms in the form of chocolate. I've never once been stopped or anything related to that. And it's become a core aspect of ceremony. I don't do mushrooms except for when I'm in ceremony. I just don't. So this is I think an important aspect. But where is it that we need to be concerned about carrying these kinds of substances?
So Colorado has now legalized a lot of these plant medicines: ayahuasca, psilocybin, San Pedro. Oregon has legalized psilocybin mushrooms. There are a number of cities like Detroit, Seattle, Washington, D.C., Oakland that have decriminalized, meaning if you have them on your person, you can no longer get arrested.
Is California now decriminalized for mushrooms?
Only Oakland and Berkeley, and maybe Santa Cruz as well. But the state has not yet. It's something that we're working on from a policy perspective. And then the Netherlands has legal psilocybin. Jamaica has legal psilocybin. Many of the countries in Central and South America, including Mexico, Costa Rica, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, have either legalized ayahuasca or decriminalized a lot of these plant medicines. So we host a retreat in Costa Rica as part of our practitioner training program, and we can legally work with psilocybin mushrooms in Costa Rica as part of that. And then, as we talked about, ketamine is legal everywhere. So it's very easy to get legal access to ketamine. And besides that, although a lot of these substances are still Schedule 1, they're still illegal. As you talked about, they are not a priority necessarily for the DEA. Now, that's not necessarily permission to bring these everywhere and, through airports and whatnot. Like, you have to exercise your own level of discernment about what you feel comfortable with. But the underground market is huge. I mean, I just mentioned the stat earlier. 8 million people took mushrooms in the United States last year alone. That number is only going to continue to grow. So, and we have an incoming.
How does that compare to cannabis, for example?
That's a good question. I would say it's probably Cannabis is probably somewhere between 15 and 20% of the population, so probably 5x with psilocybin.
That means you got a huge market coming up for psilocybin then.
There's a huge opening available. And I think with the incoming administration, they will see still, but they may be open to removing some of the regulations and shifting some of the drug laws around psychedelics to make them more accessible and available, especially to veterans or those who struggle with PTSD, depression, addiction, things like that. So I would say there was a big push the last few years. They're more accessible and available than ever. And for the most part, these are still illegal. So you have to exercise caution and discernment with how you navigate this space.
Okay. What's the latest on the research related to some of the core indications that people are now trying to use these psychedelics for, like depression, suicidality, as you said? What's the latest research showing us from, and I know Johns Hopkins has done a lot in this area as well.
So there's 3 substances that are doing, responsible for a lot of the clinical research. One is LSD. So there's a company called MindMed that is bringing LSD through clinical trials. I think it's in phase 3 at the moment for generalized anxiety disorder. So essentially for anxiety, it's showing to be highly effective for that. They would expect that to get approved by 2026. So in a couple years for LSD to be approved. You also have psilocybin being brought through clinical trials, also in phase 3 of clinical trials for both major depressive disorder and treatment-resistant depression. 2 different companies are doing that research. USONA, which is a nonprofit, and Compass Pathways, which is a for-profit. And then you also have MDMA for PTSD. And that was rejected by the FDA this year. They will
I saw that.
They'll be bringing it back through clinical trials again.
Why did it fail?
My personal opinion is the FDA moved the goalpost. They essentially said to the organization that was bringing it through clinical trials, if you do X, Y, and Z, and it shows to be clinically significant, you will get approval. That company, which is called Lykos Therapeutics, did X, Y, and Z. And the FDA basically said, oh, but what about these other things? And MAPS or Lykos said, well, you didn't mention those other things. We developed our whole experimental design hand in hand with you. You said it was good. So I think it was just like the FDA did not want to approve a psychedelic yet. That they also did not understand the therapeutic element because the FDA only governs food and drug. And when MDMA was brought to the table for phase 3 clinical trials, it was done in conjunction with psychotherapy. And so the FDA was like, we don't regulate psychotherapy. We only regulate the drug. We don't know how much of the efficacy is related to this variable of psychotherapy versus the drug. And so they ended up rejecting it, which was really, I think, really unfortunate. It really should have been approved. But they're going to go through the phase 3 clinical trials again to get it approved. So you could see within 3 years that being approved as well. And then there's a lot of other studies going on across the spectrum. There's probably at this point over 250 studies that are published every year about psychedelics. And that number is going up every year as more regulations fall away and as more funding comes in.
Got it. Okay. Well, I think that was a pretty comprehensive review of the world of psychedelics. And thank you so much, Paul. And I'm happy to go on your podcast as well. But I think people are so fascinated by this topic right now. And I do believe that it does have this unique power to be able to pull you closer to the divine. And I think it's been something that's been used like this for literally thousands of years that we've just sort of had lost knowledge regarding. And so how can people find you and how can they find more about your work?
So Third Wave, I would say go there, thethirdwave.co. You can find out more about if there are coaches or practitioners or doctors who are interested in this work. They can find out more about our training program for practitioners. I'm on Instagram and X, Paul Austin 3W. I'm fairly active on there. So find me on social, send me a note. And then if folks want to reach out, just send me a DM there, send us a note through Third Wave, and just learn about this. Educate yourself, take the next steps if this is of interest to you, and let me know or let us know how we can support your journey as you potentially explore working with psychedelics.
Thank you so much. Great to have you here with me, Paul.
Thank you, Robert.
All the best.
Thank you.
Until next week on Think Tank, have a great week.